This is class from Wednesday of week 12. We're talking about China, and we're just going to sort of look at the early periods of China, and then on Monday we're going to look at later periods in the Empire of China. Right? But we've known some patterns in these different civilizations, and as we're going to see in China, there's obviously differences, and there's also some similarities to the way we've seen other societies develop. Right? Okay, most of what we're going to be talking about took place here in the Yellow and Yangtze rivers. And they're different ecological areas of this part of Asia, right? So the southern part is more tropical. The northern part, Mongolia, is more grass and steppe land, so it's good for pastoralism, for raising animals, but not as good for agriculture. But this area was good for agriculture. It had the Yellow and Yangtze, so just like in the Indus, and just like in Mesopotamia, and just like in Egypt, right? These riverine civilizations not only were good for agriculture, but the river allowed access for trade and communication. So it meant that this area kind of developed together. Right? Okay, so here you can see the flat river floodplains in the Yellow and Yangtze rivers. And this is what Mongolia looks like. Again, grass, steppe land, not so good for agriculture, but great for raising horses. Right? Okay, so you have agriculture very early on in China, 7,000 BC or even earlier. At a certain point, these agricultural villages grow up, get larger, and there's something called the regional Neolithic, right? What that means is, just like we've seen with the Indus and other areas, that there was a similar pottery style, there was a similar architecture, right? There were lots of similarities in the sites all along the river. So this is why it's called the regional Neolithic culture. It looks like it develops together. They're not going off in different directions, right? So that kind of sets the stage. Settled agriculture Neolithic villages that slowly get larger over time. One of the sites that tells us a little bit about the early agricultural villages is this site called Bampo. Right? It's a small Neolithic village. It looks a lot like some of the villages we've seen in other parts of the world, with small houses. Some are larger than others. Right? You can see here the larger house and smaller, rounder houses. This is what the archaeologists have found, right? So the areas where the beams to support the roof, the pottery intact on the floor, right? And a lot of the pottery has animal motifs and geometric motifs. They were really well-made, handmade pottery. They're using rice, but they're also using millet as well, this grain, right? Okay, so things get larger, things get bigger. By the time you get to 3500 BC, you have a lot of markers of what we would call a complex society, right? And, think about, for just a minute, some of the features of these early chiefdoms and early complex societies. Like, what is there that helps us to identify a complex society? If you want, pause the video for just a minute and write down some of the things that you would expect in a complex society. Okay, some of the things you might expect, right, are things that show different wealth and status between people. Monumental architecture, right? You might expect craft specialization, an ideology that supports, let's say, elite status, right? All these things you would expect, and you own a certain population size. So you have all of these in this period called the Long-shan period. And what this is showing here is an oracle bone, right, with the beginnings of Chinese writing. Right? And as we saw before, oracle bones were used by leaders, right? Not everybody, but by leaders, to communicate with ancestors and spirits. Right? And so this was, you can say, this was part of an ideology that developed at this time that supported the elites, the leaders, the people in charge. Okay, you also have lots of craft goods, and these are craft goods for these elites, these leaders, right? You can see this is very thin, beautiful handmade vessel, right? And this would be very difficult to make. Something like this would be difficult to make. These are drinking vessels, right? So well-made drinking vessels, probably being used in feasts that the elites would have. So another sort of identification of what's going on, politically in terms of the organization of the people. Okay, what else do you have? You have, you can see here, earthen walls around many of these large Neolithic towns, or these large towns in China. And what that seems to suggest is there might have been warfare, and so to protect themselves, they're building walls, but this is also monumental size architecture, so it shows organization, shows the ability to get a large labor force to build some of these things, right? Okay, you also have graves that have more wealth than others, right? You have elite graves. Many of these elite graves, you're going to have status markers, right? So lots of pottery, lots of jade, as you'll see, but also another marker of status was pigs, right? So it looks like they raised pigs. Pigs were a source of wealth, and they also buried pigs in with these graves. Okay, what you can see here are jade axes and jade pendants, right? So this is an axe that would not be used as an axe. The shape is in the shape of an axe, but it's a high status, right? It's made out of jade, so it's showing that that there's a kind of connection between the elites and maybe weapons, and these things are being made in precious substances and buried with those leaders, right? Okay, so by this point, you have all of the elements of a complex society. You've got crafts, you have metallurgy, you have earthen walls, you have some warfare, you have differences in status, you have a belief system that supports the role of the elites, right? These societies get bigger and larger over time, and by the time you get to the next period, the Shang period, these are no longer towns but cities, right? And the Shang is the very first state. So the Long-shan is where you have the first chiefdoms. The Shang, you now have states, and one of the most important sites from this period is the site of Anyang, right? So at Anyang, you have a city dating to this time. One of the things that the Shang are known for are their bronzes, right? Really well-made bronze statues, vessels, things like that. Within Anyang, they found a palace, and this shows the power of kings at this time period, right? That they're running the society from these palaces. But they also found in Anyang, in these palaces, are the oracle bones. And you can see the early Chinese writing on here, and these were organized into archives within the palace. Here are some of the tortoise shells, right? So here's a tortoise shell with writing on it. These are the burn marks on the back from where the bronze needle was placed to make the cracks. This is an archive in the palace where these oracle bones were kept, right? And so we could learn a lot about what was going on in the Shang culture by reading these oracle bones, but they're essentially like a window into the past. There's evidence of sacrifice, as well as you're going to see sacrificial burials, right? But these are skulls that were found in Anyang, right? Here you can see it is Chinese archaeologist Li Qi working on some of the vessels. It's interesting because, in Chinese archaeology, the Chinese themselves were involved in it from very early on, right? So it wasn't just Europeans coming over and excavating these areas. The Chinese archaeologists themselves were very involved in this, right? Okay, according to the Chinese history, there were 11 rulers of this city of Anyang, and they didn't know if that was fact or if that was myth. But they found 11 royal tombs in Anyang, so they think that it was actually fact. These tombs are these deep pits with ramps, these kind of 4 ramps going down to the bottom. Just like the royal tombs of Sipan and the royal tombs of Ur, right? These also have sacrifices that were buried with the elite person, right? So here you can see the sacrifices around where the king would have been buried, right? And the king would have been buried somewhere here. So you could, some of these sacrifices were decapitated. Looks like a lot of it was forced. It wasn't necessarily suicide. So you could kind of imagine them being marched down to be sacrificed and then buried with the king. Right? Also buried were chariots, right? So they found in the royal burials the actual remains of the chariots with the charioteer, the driver, and the 2 horses with the bridles there intact. Chariots were the elite weapon of that period, right? They were a mark of status, and they were the kind of ultimate military vehicle at that point. So it's natural for them to be buried in a royal tomb. Warfare was very important at this time period. Anyang and other Shang cities were fighting with each other. You have lots of weapons. You have them buried in tombs, right? You have oracle bones that talk about warfare, so it's pretty clear that warfare was very important at this time. Here you can see, big bronze axe with a base, bronze helmet, bronze spears, right? And as you're going to see, the Shang fought against other cities off and on for much of their history. Okay, one of the famous queens of Chinese history from this period is a queen named Fu Hao, right? And they actually found her tomb. A lot of those, all the king's tombs were looted, so they didn't find anything except the sacrificial burials. But here in Fu Hao's tomb, they actually found a wealth of material that showed her status for sure. She was the favorite queen of a king named Wu Ding, right? And there are oracle bones that talk about Fu Hao and Wu Ding. It shows that women could get to a high level of status and power in Chinese society. She was the general of Wu Ding. She led the army into battle. She had a lot of power within the palace, right? But what they found is 400 bronzes, over 400 bronzes. They found 7,000 shells. She was buried on a bed of 7,000 shells. They found over 500 jade objects. They found 70 stone objects, right? And they found some of her servants buried with her, right? So she was buried here. Her servants were buried there. So again, sacrificial burials. And this is what the tomb looked like when it was being excavated. And this is the tomb in its final form. So hundreds of bronzes, hundreds of stone, jade pieces, right? 7,000 shells that formed a bed for her, right? So she was a very powerful person in ancient China. Right? Okay, the oracle bones, again, writing had a very special purpose in ancient China. It was a way that Chinese rulers could communicate with ancestors or spirits. And we talked about another culture where kings could communicate with their ancestors or with spirits. And if you think back, I hope you'll remember that it was the Maya, right? The Maya kings, through bloodletting, would also communicate with their ancestors and spirits. So these oracle bones can be deciphered, many of them, and so we know a little bit about what was going on. The way the oracle bones worked, again, is a question would be written where the king wanted to know something from the spirit or the god or the ancestor. Cracks would be made. The king would interpret the cracks. He would write down the prediction, and then he would write down what actually happened, right? So let's look at a couple of examples. So here's one about Fu Hao and Wu Ding. The question is, Fu Hao's childbearing will be good, right? That is, will she give birth to an heir, a male heir, or not? The king, reading the crack, said if it be a Ting day, which is a day of the week, it will be good. If it be a King day, it will be very good, extremely auspicious. Right? So Ting and Kang are days of the week. On the 31st day she gave birth, it was not good, it was a girl. Right? The baby was born on a different day of the week. Shows that the prophecy was correct. Okay, here's another one. The Fang are the enemy of the people of Anyang, right? And they're attacking the people of Anyang. They want to know if their spirit or their god, Di, right, is punishing them by using the Fang against the people of Anyang, right? So, you know, that's very important. If they're being punished by their ancestor, then they're not going to be successful if they fight the people of the Fang, right? But if D is not involved, if it's just the Fang on their own who are attacking them, then they can be successful in battle against them, right? Okay, so divine, from the Oracle Bone, it is not D who orders the Fang to make disaster for us, right? Because the Fang are harming and attacking us, we will raise men. So they found out that it is not their spirit who was punishing them by using the Fang, and so they called up an army to fight them. Right? And as we saw, the different characters change over time. They become more and more abstract through time. Right? Okay, one of the important aspects of Oracle Bones is, again, its communication with spirits, and that is very close to shamanism. Right? What we find also, these kinds of figures that are a lot like what we saw with Shavine, what we saw with the Olmec, right? These transformative figures, half man, half beast, also reflective of shamanism, right? And so we think we see the same thing, that these early rulers had these shamanistic properties, right? They were shamans who became kings in a sense, right? Okay, the Shang were known for their bronzes, and I want you to watch a video. I'm going to post a video about some of these Shang Bronzes, because there's something very interesting about them that might have led to kind of problems with the elites in ancient China. Right? So we'll stop here, and this will continue for Monday. I'll post a video and some questions for you to answer based on these videos.